The year is 980 deep in the Germanic wilderness beneath towering oaks that have stood for centuries. Something moves through the morning mist. A sound carries on the wind, not the call of birds or the rustle of leaves, but something far more ominous. The rhythmic clatter of iron on iron, the measured tramp of thousands of feet striking earth in perfect unison. A Roman legion is on the march. For 8 hours these men have been walking. Their breath comes in steady puffs in the cold air. Sweat mingles with the grime of the road on faces set in grim determination. But this is not just a walk through the forest. This is a test of human endurance that would break most modern athletes. Each legionary carries on his back a burden that would stagger a pack mule, between 60 and 100 pounds of equipment, armor, and supplies. They call it the Sarcina. And for by the next hour, we're going to discover what it truly meant to be a Roman soldier on the march. This is not the romanticized tale of gleaming eagles and triumphant conquests. This is the brutal reality of marching in a Roman legion, a story of unimaginable physical hardship, psychological trauma, and the thin line between discipline and survival in one of history's most efficient killing machines. The Roman Empire didn't conquer half the known world through luck or superior numbers. They did it by turning ordinary men into machines of war through a system so brutal, so demanding, that it would be considered torture by modern standards. At the heart of this system was a simple truth. If you couldn't march, you couldn't fight. And if you couldn't fight, you died. The burden of empire, picture this. You're a 20-year-old farmer from the hills outside Rome. Yesterday, you were worried about the harvest. Today, you're standing in formation as a recruitus, a new recruit, and a grizzled centurion is explaining what you'll be carrying for the next 25 years of your life. The Sarcina wasn't just a backpack. It was a masterpiece of military engineering designed to make a soldier completely self-sufficient in the field. But self-sufficiency came at a price. A crushing, spine-bending, soul-destroying price. Suspended from a wooden carrying pole called a furca, the Sarcina contained everything a legionary needed to survive in hostile territory. A loculus, a leather satchel containing personal items and writing materials. A waterproof cloak bag with his sagum, the red woolen cloak that served as both uniform and blanket, a bronze cooking pot, a patera or mess tin, and a cup for eating and drinking. But that was just the beginning. Each soldier carried grain rations. For 17 days, nearly 30 pounds of wheat that would be ground into flour and baked into the rock-hard biscuits called buccellatum. Water containers, oil canisters, salt for preserving meat. Personal tools, an axe for chopping wood, a shovel for digging, a sickle for cutting grain or fodder. And then there were the tools of war that every legionary was required to carry as part of his personal kit. 2 wooden stakes, each 4 feet, long and sharpened to a point, for constructing the camp palisade. Rope for tying. A tent shared between 8 men, but each soldier carried his portion of the leather panels and poles. Add to this his armor, 30 pounds of segmented plate, called larica segmentata, his helmet, his scutum shield weighing 22 pounds, his gladius sword, 2 pila javelins, and a dagger. By the time a fully equipped legionary shouldered his pack, he was carrying between 60 and 100 pounds of equipment. To put this in perspective, a modern U.S. Marine on patrol in Afghanistan typically carries about 60 to 70 pounds of gear, and that's considered at the extreme limit of human endurance. Roman legionaries carried this load not for hours, but for months. Not on level ground, but across mountains, through swamps, over broken terrain that would challenge an unencumbered hiker. And they were expected to fight at the end of each day's march. But here's what makes the Roman system truly terrifying. They didn't just carry this load occasionally, they trained with it. Roman military manuals describe how recruits were required to march 20 Roman miles, about 18 modern miles, in 5 hours while carrying their full equipment. Then, after a brief rest, they would complete another forced march of 24 Roman miles in the same time frame. This wasn't a one-time test. This was daily training. Day after day, week after week, until a man's body was reshaped by the burden he carried. Archaeological evidence from Roman military cemeteries shows distinct skeletal changes in legionary remains. Enlarged detachments where muscles strained against bone, spinal compression from years of carrying massive loads, telltale signs of stress fractures in feet and legs. The Roman military didn't just recruit soldiers, they manufactured them, forging human flesh and bone into something capable of superhuman endurance. But carrying the load was only half the battle. Because at TBS, the end of each day's march, when a modern soldier might expect to rest, the real work began. The sun is setting on another day of marching. Your feet are raw inside your caligae, the hobnailed sandals that have already walked 15 miles through mud and over stones. Your shoulders ache from the constant pressure of the carrying pole. Your back feels like it's been hammered by a blacksmith. And now your centurion is shouting orders to begin construction of the knight's camp. This was the reality that separated Roman legions from every other army in the ancient world. While their enemies simply collapsed where they stopped, Romans built a fortress, every single night, without exception. The process began with the selection of the campsite, a decision made hours earlier by advanced scouts. The ideal location needed several features: access to fresh water, defensible ground that couldn't be overlooked by higher elevations, proximity to wood for fuel and construction, and open approaches that would prevent enemy ambush. But even the perfect site was useless without the back-breaking labor that followed. As the main column arrived, the legion spread out in a carefully choreographed dance of military efficiency. Surveyor teams used measuring rods and sighting devices to lay out a perfect rectangular grid. Every camp followed the same standardized plan, so that any legionary could find his way around it in complete darkness. The commander's tent, or praetorium, occupied the center. Streets ran at right angles between designated areas for each century, each cohort, each auxiliary unit. Then came the digging. Using the very tools they had carried on their backs all day, the legionaries began excavating a perimeter ditch around the entire camp. Roman military manuals specify that this ditch should be 5 feet wide and 3 feet deep. Modest dimensions until you consider that a single legion's marching camp might require a ditch stretching for over 2 miles around its perimeter. Historical estimates suggest that a full-strength legion could excavate between 70,000 and 100,000 cubic feet of earth for a typical knight's fortification. That's enough dirt to fill more than 1,500 modern dump trucks. And it had to be dug by hand, with the small military shovels each soldier carried. But digging the ditch was only the beginning. The excavated soil was piled into a rampart on the inner edge of the ditch, creating a wall 4 to 6 feet high. This rampart was then reinforced with the wooden stakes every legionary had carried all day. Thousands of these stakes were woven together to create a palisade that would stop enemy cavalry and break up infantry charges. The entire process took between 3 and 6 hours, depending on the size of the force and the condition of the ground. This meant that legionaries who had marched for 8 hours while carrying 100 pounds of equipment would then spend another 4 hours digging fortifications before they could even think about food or rest. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars provide us with a chilling example of this system in action. During the Battle of the Sambre River in 57 BC, Caesar's 8 legions constructed a marching camp that archaeological research suggests covered 160 acres, a space of $774,000 square yards. The surrounding ditch alone was over 2 miles long. Modern estimates suggest it required over 3,000 man-hours of labor to complete, meaning more than 2,100 men worked for several hours to build this single knight's fortification. And remember, this happened every single day of a campaign. March for 8 hours carrying crushing loads, then build a fortress, then prepare for the possibility of night attack. Day after day, week after week, month after month. The psychological impact of this routine was as brutal as the physical demands. There was no rest, no respite, no moment when a legionary could simply exist without the weight of expectation and exhaustion crushing down on him. The Roman military system ground men down to their essential elements, stripping away everything except the capacity to endure and obey. But even this crushing routine paled in comparison to the psychological warfare that held the entire system together. Deep in the Germanic forests, around the smoking remains of a hastily built campfire, a young legionary named Marcus sits cleaning his gladius. His hands shake slightly, not from cold, but from something far more insidious. 3 days ago, he watched his tentmate, a veteran named Gaius, receive 20 lashes for falling asleep on watch. Yesterday, he witnessed something that will haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might be. A decimation. The word itself has passed into our language as a synonym for massive destruction, but its original meaning was far more precise and infinitely more terrifying. Decimation was the Roman military's ultimate expression of collective punishment, the execution of every 10th man in a unit that had shown cowardice, mutiny, or unauthorized retreat. The process was as methodical as everything else in the Roman military machine. The disgraced unit would be assembled in formation. Names would be written on pieces of pottery or placed in a helmet. Then, in a lottery of death, every 10th name would be drawn. Those selected would be beaten to death by their own comrades, not by professional executioners, but by the very men who had shared their tent, their bread, their fears. The psychological toll was incalculable. Modern military psychologists understand that forcing soldiers to kill their own comrades creates lasting trauma that can destroy unit cohesion and individual mental health. But the Romans calculated that the fear of decimation was more powerful than its destructive effects. They were probably right. Historical records suggest that decimation was used sparingly, perhaps a dozen times in the entire history of the Republic and early Empire. But its rarity made it more terrifying, not less. Every legionary knew that it existed as the ultimate consequence of collective failure. The mere possibility hung over every decision, every moment of weakness, every whispered complaint about conditions or commanders. But decimation was only the most extreme expression of a disciplinary system that pervaded every aspect of military life. Roman military law recognized dozens of offenses punishable by death: desertion, cowardice in battle, sleeping on guard duty, losing one's weapons, striking an officer. Lesser offenses could result in flogging, reduction in rank, forfeited pay, or the humiliation of being forced to camp outside the legion's fortifications. The centurions who enforced this discipline were legendary for their brutality. They carried a vinewood staff called a vitis that served as both symbol of authority and instrument of punishment. A centurion could order immediate beatings for minor infractions, and the literary sources are filled with references to the casual violence that accompanied military training and daily routine. The poet Juvenal wrote sarcastically about centurions who break their vine sticks on the backs of soldiers, referring to staffs that were literally worn out from striking men. Tacitus records that one centurion was nicknamed "Give me another," because he broke so many vine sticks on soldiers' bodies that he constantly demanded replacements. This wasn't sadism for its own sake. It was a calculated system designed to make death in battle seem preferable to the consequences of disobedience. And it worked. Roman legions developed a reputation for discipline under pressure that was unmatched in the ancient world. They could maintain formation while under arrow fire, execute complex maneuvers in the midst of combat, and fight to the death rather than break ranks. But this system extracted a terrible psychological price. Modern research into combat trauma has identified the key factors that create lasting mental damage in soldiers: exposure to violence, helplessness in life-threatening situations, and the breakdown of social bonds through betrayal or loss. The Roman military system deliberately incorporated all three elements. Legionaries witnessed constant violence, not just in battle, but in daily punishments, training accidents, and the routine brutality of camp life. They lived in a state of perpetual vulnerability, knowing that their survival depended entirely on the decisions of officers who saw them as expendable resources, and the disciplinary system deliberately damaged the social bonds between soldiers by forcing them to participate in each other's punishment. Ancient sources suggest that Romans were aware of what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Military medical manuals describe soldiers who became unable to fight due to phantom wounds, invisible injuries that caused shaking, inability to sleep, and unpredictable behavior. The physician Galen wrote about gladiators and soldiers who suffered from what he called melancholia following battle, a condition marked by withdrawal, nightmares, and sudden outbursts of violence. Roman culture dealt with these psychological casualties through a combination of stoicism, ritual purification, and simple denial. Soldiers were expected to suppress their emotional responses through philosophical discipline and religious observance. Those who couldn't were often quietly discharged or assigned to non-combat duties, becoming the forgotten victims of Rome's military machine. But for those who endured, there was a grim reward waiting in the forests of Germania. The ultimate test of everything the Roman system had built into them, a test that would end in disaster and reveal the true cost of turning men into machines. September 9th AD. The Teutoburg Forest. 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, are moving through dense woodlands in what is now northwestern Germany. These are not green recruits, but seasoned veterans. The 16th Legion was first raised by Julius Caesar during the civil wars. The 16th had fought in the conquest of Gaul. The 9th had spilled blood from Spain to the Danube. Thousands of Rome's finest soldiers, led by Publius Quinctilius Varus, a man whose political connections exceeded his military competence. They are marching through territory they believe to be pacified, following routes suggested by their Germanic auxiliaries. At their head rides Arminius, a young prince of the Cherusci tribe who holds Roman citizenship and commands Germanic cavalry units. Arminius is leading them into the greatest military disaster in Roman history. The legionaries don't know it yet, but they are about to discover what happens when the Roman system of discipline and endurance meets an enemy who understands its weaknesses better than its strengths. The march begins normally. 20 miles a day along forest paths carrying their crushing loads of equipment. The weather is turning cold as autumn deepens, and frequent rains turn the trails into ribbons of sucking mud. The column stretches for nearly 15 miles. Legionaries, intermixed with baggage carts, camp followers, merchants, and the families that unofficially accompanied the army. On the first day, scattered attacks begin. Germanic warriors emerge from the forest like ghosts, hurl javelins and stones, then vanish back into the undergrowth. This is guerrilla warfare at its most effective, mobile, unpredictable, designed to exhaust and demoralize rather than win decisive battles. The Roman response is exactly what their training has taught them. Maintain formation, continue the march, build the fortified camp, trust in discipline and superior equipment. But their Germanic enemies have spent years studying Roman methods. They know that legionaries are most vulnerable when strung out on the march, when their superior organization becomes a liability in broken terrain. By the second day, the attacks intensify. The Germanic coalition, led not just by Arminius's Cherusci but by the Marsi, Bructeri, and other tribes, has assembled perhaps 18,000 warriors. They strike at the weakest points in the Roman column: the baggage train, the non-combatants, the auxiliaries who lack the heavy armor and intensive training of the legionaries. The Romans are learning the terrible arithmetic of asymmetric warfare. Every Germanic casualty can be replaced from the surrounding tribes. Every Roman loss weakens the force that must continue marching toward safety. The legions are like a wounded animal being bled to death by a pack of wolves. Varus, finally understanding his situation, makes the decisions that his training dictates. Burn the baggage. Abandon the wounded who cannot march. Strip the column to its essential elements and push forward as quickly as possible. These are the choices that Roman military doctrine prescribes, and they might have worked against a conventional enemy. But Arminius understands Roman psychology as well as Roman tactics. He knows that legionaries have been conditioned to trust in their system, to believe that discipline and endurance will always triumph over barbarian savagery. He is about to demonstrate the fatal flaw in that belief. On the third day, the remaining Romans, perhaps 10,000 men still capable of fighting, enter a narrow passage between the Calcrease Hill and what was then called the Great Bog. The path is no more than 60 feet wide in places, barely enough for the Roman column to maintain any semblance of formation. Here, the Germanic coalition has prepared their masterpiece of tactical deception. They have constructed a turf wall along the hillside, camouflaged with branches and grass to appear like a natural rise in the ground. Behind this wall, thousands of warriors wait in perfect silence. When the trap is sprung, it happens with devastating suddenness. War cries echo from every direction as Germanic forces attack the Roman column from front, flanks, and rear simultaneously. The carefully constructed Roman formation, the foundation of their tactical superiority, disintegrates in minutes. In open ground, the legionaries might have rallied. Their training in close-order combat, their superior armor and weapons, their disciplined response to commands might have turned the tide. But here, in the narrow passage, surrounded by enemies who appear and vanish like forest spirits, all their advantages become disadvantages. The very equipment that made them superior soldiers becomes a burden. Their heavy armor slows them in, the mud and undergrowth. Their large shields catch on branches and bushes. Their tactical formations require space that doesn't exist in the tangled forest. The system that had conquered Gaul and Britain and Germania itself becomes a trap that holds them in place while their enemies tear them apart. Individual legionaries fight with the courage and skill their training instilled, but courage cannot overcome the mathematics of annihilation. For every Germanic warrior who falls, two more emerge from the forest. The Roman column fragments into isolated pockets of resistance, each fighting desperately but unable to coordinate with their comrades. Varus, wounded and seeing his legions disintegrating around him, makes the final gesture that Roman honor demands. Rather than face capture and certain torture, he falls on his sword. His senior officers follow suit, leaving their men leaderless in an increasingly hopeless situation. The slaughter continues through the day and into the night. When it ends, 3 of Rome's finest legions have been completely destroyed. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield shows the remains of last stands. Clusters of Roman equipment and human bones marking the spots where groups of legionaries fought to the death rather than surrender. Of the 15,000 Romans who entered the Teutoburg Forest, perhaps a few dozen escaped to carry news of the disaster back to the Rhine. The Germanic coalition had achieved what no enemy had managed since Hannibal, the complete annihilation of a major Roman army. But the true horror was still to come. Germanic warriors didn't simply kill their enemies and leave the field. They had scores to settle with the representatives of Roman power, and they intended to settle them in the most public and painful way possible. When the fighting ended, the forest floor was carpeted with Roman dead. But many legionaries were still alive, wounded, exhausted, and now at the mercy of enemies who had suffered under Roman occupation for years. What followed was a deliberate reversal of the power relationship that had defined Germanic-Roman relations. Tacitus, writing years later from Roman accounts, describes scenes that read like something from the most brutal horror fiction. Roman officers were singled out for special attention. Their eyes were put out with spears. Their tongues were cut from their mouths. Their hands were severed and nailed to trees as trophies. One centurion, identified by his vinewood staff of authority, had his tongue removed while still alive. As the Germanic warrior held the severed organ, he reportedly shouted, "Now, snake, your hissing is finished." But individual torture was only the beginning. The Germanic tribes practiced a form of ritualized warfare that demanded religious as well as military satisfaction. Hundreds of Roman prisoners were dragged to sacred groves scattered throughout the forest. Here, in ceremonies dedicated to their war gods, they were sacrificed in ways designed to mirror the suffering they had inflicted on Germanic peoples. Some were hanged from oak trees, their bodies left as offerings to Woden, the one-eyed, god of war and death. Others had their throats cut on stone altars, their blood poured out to consecrate Germanic victory. Weapons, armor, and military standards were thrown into sacred pools as gifts to the supernatural powers who had granted victory. The eagle standards of the 3 legions, the 17th, Zodiath, and 19, were captured and became the most prized trophies of the Germanic victory. These gilded bronze eagles were more than military symbols. They were the spiritual embodiment of Roman power, objects so sacred that legionaries were sworn to die rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Their capture represented the complete humiliation of Roman military might. Even more disturbing was the deliberate mutilation of Varus's corpse. The Germanic warriors dug up his partially burned body and decapitated it. The head was sent as a trophy to Maroboduus, king of the Marcomanni, as proof of Germanic power and a warning about the fate of Roman collaborators. But the psychological warfare didn't end with death. Some Roman prisoners were kept alive and distributed among the Germanic tribes as slaves. Men who had expected to retire as Roman citizens with grants of land and money instead spent their remaining years as property, tending Germanic livestock, and serving in Germanic households. Decades later, during subsequent Roman campaigns in Germany, a few of these survivors were recovered, broken old men who had lived their entire adult lives as the possessions of their former enemies. The news of the disaster reached Augustus in Rome, along with Varus's severed head, which Maroboduus had eventually returned through diplomatic channels. The emperor's reaction became legendary. For months afterward, he would beat his head against doors and walls, crying out, "Quinctili vare, legiones rede, Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The psychological impact on Rome was catastrophic. More than 10% of the empire's total military strength had been wiped out in 3 days. The myth of Roman invincibility, carefully cultivated through centuries of conquest, lay shattered in a German forest. Augustus disbanded his Germanic bodyguard and posted sentries throughout Rome to prevent barbarian uprisings. The numbers of the destroyed legions, 17, 18, and 19, were never reused, a permanent reminder of the disaster. But the true cost went beyond military casualties. The Teutoburg disaster marked the end of Roman expansion beyond the Rhine. Augustus's grandiose plan to extend the empire to the Elbe River was abandoned. Germany east of the Rhine would remain forever beyond Roman control, creating a cultural and political boundary that would influence European history for the next 2,000 years. The survivors who did escape the forest carried more than news of military defeat. They carried the psychological scars of men who had seen their entire worldview destroyed. These were soldiers who had been conditioned to believe that Roman discipline and endurance were superior to barbarian savagery. They had watched that belief die along with their comrades in the German mud. Modern analysis of the battlefield has revealed the true genius of Arminius's strategy. He didn't simply defeat the Roman legions through superior numbers or better weapons. He used the Romans' own strengths against them, turning their discipline into rigidity, their equipment into encumbrance, their confidence into fatal blindness. The very qualities that made Roman legionaries superior in conventional warfare became vulnerabilities in the Teutoburg ambush. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of a disaster so complete that it challenged the fundamental assumptions of Roman military culture. Scattered across miles of forest floor, researchers have found the detritus of a destroyed army: corroded armor fragments, broken weapons, coins stamped with Varus's name, medical instruments from the legion's field hospitals, even the remains of writing tablets on which soldiers had recorded their final thoughts. But perhaps the most haunting discoveries are the human remains themselves. Forensic analysis of skulls found at the battlefield shows clear evidence of torture and execution. Sword cuts that were obviously inflicted after death. Evidence of systematic mutilation designed to degrade and humiliate rather than simply kill. The Germanic coalition had achieved something unprecedented in Roman military history. They had completely destroyed not just an army, but the psychological foundation on which that army was built. They had proven that Roman soldiers, for all their training and discipline and equipment, were still just men, and men could be broken. 6 years would pass before another Roman army entered the Teutoburg Forest. When they finally came, led by Germanicus Caesar, nephew of the Emperor Tiberius, they found a landscape that had become a monument to military disaster. The scene that greeted the Roman recovery expedition was one of almost unimaginable horror. The forest floor was carpeted with the whitened bones of men and animals, scattered by scavengers and weather across miles of wilderness. Broken weapons lay rusting, among the roots of oak trees. Fragments of armor, corroded green with age, hung from branches where they had been placed as offerings to Germanic war gods. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence of the systematic nature of the massacre. In grove after grove, Roman soldiers found human skulls nailed to tree trunks, not randomly, but arranged in deliberate patterns that suggested ritual significance. These were the remains of officers and centurions, identified by fragments of their distinctive equipment, who had been singled out for special treatment by their captors. Germanicus ordered his men to gather the remains for proper Roman burial. But the psychological impact on the troops was devastating. As Tacitus recorded, not a soldier knowing whether he was interring the relics of a relative or a stranger, but looking on all as kinsfolk and of their own blood, while their wrath rose higher than ever against the foe. The recovery expedition had expected to find a battlefield. Instead, they found evidence of something far more systematic, a deliberate reversal of Roman military culture, conducted with a thoroughness that suggested intimate knowledge of Roman customs and psychology. This was the true genius of Arminius's victory. He hadn't simply defeated a Roman army, he had used Roman methods to destroy Roman morale. The systematic torture of officers mimicked Roman disciplinary practices. The ritual, sacrifice of prisoners, followed Roman traditions of religious warfare. The mutilation of Varus's corpse was a direct response to Roman practices of displaying enemy heads as trophies. The Germanic coalition had held up a mirror to Roman military culture and shown it to be capable of the same brutality it claimed to oppose. The result was a psychological wound that would never fully heal. Even more disturbing was what the recovery expedition learned about the last hours of the Roman defenders. Archaeological evidence suggests that small groups of legionaries had managed to break out of the main ambush and establish defensive positions in various locations throughout the forest. These men had followed their training, using their entrenching tools to dig hasty fortifications and their shields to create protective barriers. The evidence shows that some of these positions held out for hours, perhaps even days, after the main force was destroyed. But without hope of rescue or resupply, they were eventually overwhelmed one by one. The Germanic warriors had methodically hunted down every survivor, ensuring that no Roman would live to carry detailed news of their tactics back to the Rhine. This systematic approach to annihilation revealed something crucial about the nature of the Germanic victory. This wasn't a spontaneous tribal uprising, but a carefully planned military operation conducted by leaders who understood Roman strengths and weaknesses with deadly precision. Arminius himself embodied this knowledge. Raised in Rome, trained in Roman military schools, awarded Roman citizenship for his service in the legions, he possessed an intimate understanding of the system he had chosen to destroy. He knew that Roman discipline was both the source of their strength and the key to their defeat. The Germanic victory demonstrated that the Roman military system, for all its apparent superiority, contained fatal contradictions. The same rigid discipline that made legionaries superior in conventional warfare made them vulnerable to unconventional tactics. The same equipment that protected them in open battle became a burden in difficult terrain. The same training that taught them to trust their commanders made them susceptible to betrayal by those commanders. Most importantly, the Teutoburg disaster revealed the psychological fragility of the Roman military machine. Legionaries had been conditioned to believe that their system was inherently superior to barbarian methods. When that belief was shattered, the entire structure of Roman military morale collapsed. The impact of this revelation extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. Roman writers struggled to explain how 3 of their finest legions could have been completely destroyed by enemies they considered inferior. Some blamed Varus's incompetence, others pointed to Germanic treachery. A few suggested supernatural intervention. But the most perceptive Roman observers understood that the disaster revealed fundamental flaws in their military culture. The historian Velleius Paterculus, himself a veteran of the Germanic wars, wrote that the defeat showed how an army unexcelled in bravery, the first of Roman armies in discipline, in energy, and in experience in the field, could be exterminated, almost to a man, by the very enemy whom it has always slaughtered like cattle. The key word is slaughtered. Paterculus recognized that Roman military superiority had always depended on treating their enemies as less than human. When those enemies proved capable of using Roman methods against Roman soldiers, the entire foundation of imperial confidence cracked. The psychological damage was compounded by the Germanic coalition's decision to preserve the battlefield as a shrine to their victory. For years afterward, Roman patrols would encounter evidence of the massacre: bones scattered by wild animals, weapons arranged in ritualistic patterns, human skulls grinning from tree branches. The forest itself had become a psychological weapon, a permanent reminder of Roman vulnerability. The response of individual legionaries to this trauma varied, but the overall pattern was clear. The Roman army had lost something essential in the Teutoburg Forest. Not just men and equipment, but the absolute confidence in their system that had made conquest possible. This loss of confidence manifested in various ways. Roman forces became more cautious in their tactics, less willing to take the kind of aggressive risks that had characterized earlier campaigns. Recruitment became more difficult as news of the disaster spread throughout the empire. The legendary Roman discipline began to crack under the pressure of constant vigilance against an enemy who might strike from anywhere, at any time. Perhaps most tellingly, the Romans never again attempted to establish permanent occupation east of the Rhine. The Teutoburg disaster had taught them that there were limits to what their military system could achieve, boundaries beyond which Roman methods became liabilities rather than advantages. The forest had claimed more than 3 legions. It had claimed the myth of Roman invincibility itself. In the end, what killed those 15,000 Romans in the Teutoburg Forest wasn't superior Germanic weapons or overwhelming numbers. It was the weight of their own system, the crushing burden of equipment, discipline, and expectation that had made them the masters of the known world. Every ounce of gear in a legionary's sarcina told a story about Roman military culture. The 17 days' worth of grain represented self-sufficiency, the ability to operate deep in enemy territory without supply lines. The entrenching tools represented engineering superiority, the capacity to turn any piece of ground into a fortress. The standardized equipment represented industrial efficiency, the power to equip massive armies with identical, high-quality gear. But in the narrow passages of the Teutoburg Forest, self-sufficiency became a crushing burden that slowed retreat. Engineering superiority became useless when there was no time to dig. Industrial efficiency became a liability when standardized tactics met unconventional warfare. The Romans had created a military machine so efficient, so disciplined, so reliable, that it had forgotten how to adapt. And in that failure of adaptation lay the seeds of imperial decline. Modern military historians studying the Teutoburg disaster often focus on tactical details: the effectiveness of Germanic ambush tactics, the vulnerability of extended columns in difficult terrain, the importance of local knowledge in asymmetric warfare. These lessons are important, but they miss the deeper truth that the disaster revealed. The Romans didn't lose because they lacked courage or skill or equipment. They lost because they had become prisoners of their own success. The very system that had made them invincible had also made them inflexible. The discipline that had conquered Gaul and Britain and Syria became a trap when faced with enemies who refused to fight according to Roman rules. This is the brutal reality that haunted every Roman soldier who survived the Teutoburg disaster. The knowledge that all their training, all their sacrifice, all their endurance could be undone by enemies who understood their weaknesses better than they understood themselves. The psychological impact of this realization extended far beyond individual trauma. It called into question the fundamental assumptions that held the Roman Empire together. If Roman soldiers could be defeated by Germanic tribesmen, if Roman discipline could be turned into a weapon against Rome itself, then what was the source of Roman power? The answer, uncomfortable as it was for Roman leaders to acknowledge, was that Roman power had always depended on the willing cooperation of their enemies. As long as Germanic tribes fought according to Germanic traditions, massed charges, personal duels, battles of honor and glory, Roman discipline and equipment would prevail. But when Germanic leaders like Arminius learned to fight according to to Roman principles while abandoning Roman constraints, the balance of power shifted dramatically. The Teutoburg disaster marked the beginning of a new era in military history, one in which technological and organizational advantages could be neutralized by adaptive enemies who understood how to turn strengths into weaknesses. It was a lesson that empires throughout history would learn and relearn, often at terrible cost. But for the individual legionaries who lived through the experience, the lesson was more personal and more devastating. They had been taught that Roman methods were superior to all alternatives, that discipline and endurance would always triumph over barbarian chaos. The forest had shown them that this belief was not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. The men who escaped the Teutoburg ambush carried this knowledge back to the Rhine, where it spread like a virus through the Roman military community. They had seen the end of Roman invincibility, and they could never unsee it. The weight of that knowledge, the burden of understanding that everything they had been taught about their own superiority was a lie, was perhaps heavier than any pack they had ever carried. Today, if you walk through the forests of northwestern Germany near the town of Kalkreis, you can still find traces of that September disaster in 9 AD. Archaeological excavations have revealed coins scattered in the patterns of fleeing men, fragments of armor corroded by 2 millennia of German weather, medical instruments from the legion's field hospitals that never had time to operate. The wooden stakes that every legionary carried for camp construction have long since rotted away. The leather satchels and wool cloaks have returned to the earth that bred them. The bones of men and animals have been scattered by wild boars and winter storms, but the weight remains. Not the physical weight of bronze and iron and grain, but the psychological weight of a system that demanded everything from the men who served it. The weight of discipline that could not bend. The weight of confidence that could not doubt. The weight of assumptions that could not be questioned. In museum cases across Europe, you can see the artifacts of Roman military power. Perfectly crafted armor, precisely balanced weapons, engineering tools that speak of mathematical precision and industrial efficiency. These objects seem to radiate competence and authority, the physical manifestation of a system that conquered half the world. But they also carry the weight of limitation. Each perfectly standardized piece of equipment represents a decision made in Rome by men who had never walked through Germanic forests or fought Germanic warriors. Each regulation that governed a legionary's load was written by officers who would never have to carry that load for 20 miles through hostile territory. The brutal reality of marching in a Roman legion was that individual human beings were expected to carry not just physical burdens but the entire weight of imperial ambition. They were walking embodiments of Roman power, responsible for maintaining Roman discipline and Roman superiority in the face of enemies who were fighting for their homes, their families, their freedom. And sometimes, that weight was too much for any human being to bear. The Roman military system achieved things that seem impossible by modern standards. It created soldiers who could march 20 miles a day carrying 100 pounds of equipment, then build fortifications, then fight battles, then march again the next day. It maintained discipline across thousands of miles of frontier in dozens of different climates and cultures for centuries. But it also created human beings who were so constrained by their training, so burdened by their equipment, so trapped by their assumptions that they could not adapt when adaptation meant survival. The same system that made them superior in conventional warfare made them vulnerable when warfare became unconventional. The legionaries who died in the Teutoburg Forest were not cowards or weaklings. They were among the most highly trained, best equipped, most disciplined soldiers in human history. They died because the very qualities that made them superior soldiers also made them prisoners of a system that could not imagine its own defeat. Their story is not just about ancient warfare or Roman history. It's about the weight that systems place on individuals, the burden of carrying expectations that may be too heavy for any human being to bear. It's about the moment when training becomes rigid, when discipline becomes brittleness, when strength becomes weakness. Every modern military organization studies the Teutoburg disaster because it reveals something essential about the nature of military power. That superiority is always temporary, that advantages can become disadvantages, that the enemy you defeat is never the same as the enemy you face next. But perhaps the most important lesson is simpler and more human. The Roman legionaries who marched into the Teutoburg Forest were men carrying burdens, physical and psychological, that would have broken most of us. They carried those burdens because their society demanded it, because their system required it, because they had been taught that carrying such burdens was what made them Roman. In the end, that weight, the weight of empire, the weight of expectation, the weight of a system that demanded perfection from imperfect human beings, was what killed them. Not Germanic spears or Germanic strategy, but the inability to put down a burden that had become too heavy to carry. The brutal reality of marching in a Roman legion was that every step was taken under the weight of the world. And sometimes, even, the strongest men stumble. In the forests of Germany 2,000 years later, that weight still echoes. In the rustle of leaves that might be footsteps, in the shadows that might be watching eyes, in the wind that carries the memory of men who carried too much, marched too far, and paid the ultimate price for the ambitions of an empire that demanded everything and gave back only the cold comfort of discipline. The march continues. The weight remains. And somewhere in the distance, if you listen carefully, you might still hear the sound of hobnailed sandals on ancient roads, carrying burdens that no human being was ever meant to bear, but carrying them anyway. Because that's what it meant to be Roman. That's what it cost to build an empire, and that's why empires in the end always fall under their own weight. The legion is eternal. The march never ends. And the weight is forever.